Hello, I'm back, and this video I will be talking about a German author, also a Nobel Prize winner for literature, Hermann Hesse, who is definitely one of my favorite authors of all time. So I'll be going through three of his works by chronological order, and the first one is Siddhartha, the second one is Steppenwolf, and the third one is Narcissus and Goldmund. Overarching theme in the three books that I've read, I realized that Hesse really likes to focus on an exploration of the individual psyche, particularly on the spiritual level. So he asks questions like, what is the best way to live, and what are the implications of the different ways of living? And in his works, the plot mainly works in service of this philosophical exploration. I would say one of the main purpose of this video is for me to go through all the philosophy about life that he's talked about in these three works, and I'll admit that they had a really profound influence on me and really changed the way that I look at life and the world. So by chronological order, the first one I'm going to introduce is Siddhartha. It was written in 1922, and it draws on the spiritual journey of a man called Siddhartha, as the title names, and it's set during the time of the Buddha in India. I would say that it draws really heavily on Indian philosophy, which Hesse has like personal knowledge and experience of, given that he's lived in India. I won't be commenting too much on this aspect because I personally do not know much about Indian philosophy, but there are a lot of general wisdom about life you can get through the book without relying on knowledge of Indian philosophy or religion. So at the beginning of the story, we have Siddhartha, a young man who's from a very well-off family, and he decides to leave his home to start a journey with the samanas, who are people who live in the ascetic lifestyle, because he believed that in the world everything lied, stank of lies. They were all illusions of sense, happiness and beauty. All were doomed to decay. The world tasted bitter. Life was pain. So due to this mindset, he wanted to figure out what is the truth in this world and what is the best way that he could deal with it. So in the opening chapters, he said he aimed no longer to be self, to experience the peace of an emptied heart, and to experience pure thought. So he spent some time living the ascetic lifestyle with the samanas, and then he realized that he's been going in the wrong direction, because he realizes that it's impossible to escape permanently from the self. And after an encounter with the Buddha, he decides to leave the samanas and stop running from the self. Also, he decided to stop treating the world as an illusion. And this famous excerpt of his realization goes, "But I, who wished to read the book of the world and the book of my own nature, did presume to despise the letters and signs. I called the world of appearances illusion. I called my eyes and tongue chance. Now it is over. I have awakened." Now he really decides to go into the world and face the world. So what he starts by doing is, in the middle of the book, this chapter called Kamala, he meets this rich woman, Kamala, who's really beautiful, and he decides to experience the sensual pleasure of sex with her. She wants him to be rich, otherwise she wouldn't be with him. So he goes and learns trade with a merchant, and he becomes rich, and he spends many years indulging himself in those worldly pleasures of material wealth and sensuality. And this episode in the book is important because one of the key messages of the book is that all experience is valuable, and you can't judge that this is not the right way to live before you've experienced it. So it's only after this episode that he realizes these worldly pleasures are not for him, because all other people seem to be able to pursue worldly goals, like wealth, fame, status, or like love with other people. Things that most people pursue don't mean anything to him, and he hasn't been able to find any sort of fulfillment in it, and it just kind of seems like everything is passing him by. So he leaves this life, and then he goes and sits by a river, and that's a very key turning point in the book. And then when he was sitting by the river, he was overcome by this sudden change, and this is sort of related to the Buddhist religious philosophy, how the Buddha is full of love towards all living beings. So when he was sitting by the river, suddenly he realizes he was full of joyous love towards everything that he saw, and it seemed to him that was just why he was previously so ill, because he could love nothing and nobody. So, and then he meets this wise old ferryman called Vasudeva, and he stays with Vasudeva, and they both work as ferrymen by the river for a while. So a key theme developed in this section is the idea of listening to the wisdom of the river. So it's gesturing to a way of life in the absence of pursuit, desire, fixation, and just loving things and accepting things how they are in the world. His general transformation is that he is able to love everything, and he realizes that of people in the world, even though they're worldly and they're not like him, their vanities, desires, and trivialities no longer seemed absurd to him. They had become understandable, lovable, and even worthy of respect. So this sort of wisdom is key to his spiritual growth, because he's no longer fixated upon judging what is good, bad, correct, wrong, etc. This is pretty similar to the wisdom of the Buddha. And near the end of the story, when he finally reaches his conclusion, he says, "All the voices, all the goals, all the yearnings, all the sorrows, all the pleasures, all the good and evil, all of them together was the world. All of them together was the stream of events, the music of life." Until the end, he does sort of stay near the river, and it's this theme of accepting and loving everything that flows through you and flows through life and exists in the world. So in the end, I would summarize Siddhartha's conclusion in 3 points, and that's my personal interpretation. Firstly, no one is one-sided, so everyone has both the saint and the sinner in him. Secondly, it's impossible to transmit wisdom. Each man must learn and experience for himself before coming to his own conclusion. And thirdly, and I quote this from the book, everything that exists is good, everything needs only my agreement, my assent, my loving understanding, then all is well with me and nothing can harm me. Moving on to the second book, Steppenwolf. It was written in 1927, and this is actually my favorite book out of the all 3 that I've read of Hesse's works, and it's also the first one that I've read. Its protagonist is a middle-aged man named Harry who calls himself Steppenwolf, an identity that it's intended to highlight his alienation from society, and in particular his disgust towards the bourgeois and against like the popular culture of his time. And it's important to distinguish that popular culture from what we call popular culture now, because it's like the 1920s. And he sees himself suffering because he tends to think deeply while everyone else indulges in shallow pleasures. So for example, he uses the metaphor of dry land versus water, a former conveying the mundane bourgeois way of life which focuses on self-preservation and getting through shallow pleasures, not willing to dwell deeply on the meaninglessness and sufferings of life, and the latter, which is like the idea of swimming in water, as characterizing himself in his constant intellectual pursuits. In this very key passage, he says, "Of course they don't want to swim. After all, they were born to live on dry land, not in water. Nor, of course, do they want to think. They weren't made to think, but to live. It's true, and anyone who makes thinking his priority may well go far as a thinker. But when all's said and done, he has just mistaken water for dry land, and one of these days he'll drown." On top of this, another prominent theme explored in the book is the idea of personal identity as something that is fractured into thousands of pieces. So he says, Harry is not made up of 2 characters, but of hundreds, thousands. His life, like that of every human being, does not oscillate between 2 poles only, say, between body and the mind or spirit, between the saint and the profligate, but between thousands, between innumerable polar opposites. Having established who he is and what sort of position he's in, the book goes on to talk about his development. So in the second half of the book, he meets a woman called Hermione, and she teaches him to dance and listen to jazz music, and these are indulgences that he usually disdained as like the lower pleasures. And what she teaches him is that the source of all his suffering is that he takes everything too seriously. He thinks himself committed to accessing life at its finest and most profound, and that's what I quote from the book, through those intellectual pursuits and indulgence only in high art. But she says he shouldn't be like this and he should take everything more lightly. And then the last part of the novel turns to a sort of magical realism as he enters into an imaginary conversation with Mozart and Goethe, who teaches him the ultimate lesson that there's no point in trying to purify all the rubbish or dross out of life and therefore focus only on the most profound or like the posh enjoyments. And the attempt to do so is the source of Harry's misery. If Harry has learnt to laugh at life overall as if it's totally a joke, then high or low pleasure would make no difference to him, and he would be able to enjoy it all indiscriminately and lightly. In this famously long passage, Mozart basically tells him this lesson about life, and I'm going to read it. What you're hearing now, you see, is not Handel as violated by the radio, a Handel who even in this most abysmal of guises remained divine. No, what you are hearing and seeing, sir, is at one and the same time an excellent metaphor of all life. Just as the radio randomly flings 10 minutes worth of the most magnificent music on earth into totally inappropriate places like middle-class drawing rooms and the garrets of the poor, filling the ears of its subscribers with it as they chatter, feed, yawn, and sleep. Just as it robs this music of all its sensuous beauty, ruins it, reducing it to mere mucus and crackling sounds, yet still failing to kill its entire spirit, so does life, or so-called reality, stand the world's splendid repertoire of images hurling all over the place. The whole of life is like that, young man, and we have no choice but to accept the fact and, if we have any sense, laugh about it. You ought rather to learn how to listen first, to take seriously what is worth taking seriously, and to laugh about the rest. So the message here is there's no need to put an absolute filter through things. The deep and the shallow can coexist and be enjoyed together. And the last book I'm going to be talking about is Narcissus and Goldmund. This one is written in 1930, and it's set in medieval times. Its protagonist is Goldmund, who starts his life in a monastery under the guidance of his friend Narcissus, who was already a respected religious scholar at a young age. And basically, even though Goldmund starts off in the monastery, he was allured by the sensual pleasure of sexual intercourse, and he leaves the monastery in pursuit of like what he called the game of love with a beautiful woman. And so from that point onwards, he starts exploring the world as a vagabond. For most of his early adventures all involve kind of making love with different women, but none really leave a permanent mark on him. And then in the middle of the book, he also experienced the Black Death raging through the villages, and he's also killed other people for self-defense. He also spent a few years learning with a sculpting master about sculpting, and he made this really amazing sculpture, which was inspired by the image of Narcissus, like his friend, during childhood. Closer to the end of the book, he returns to that original monastery and reunites with Narcissus, and that's basically like the bulk of the story. The protagonist being able to grow spiritually throughout his physical journey is pretty much similar to the way that Hesse has intended the story of Siddhartha to work. I'm going to summarize some lessons from Goldmund's wanderings. The first lesson is Hesse uses the two characters Narcissus and Goldmund to frame a sort of antithesis. So Narcissus is represented as someone who understands life and the world through intellectual pursuits by studying like those ancient texts and logic, and Goldmund is like the opposite. He learns through feeling and experiencing. So they represent two opposite ways of approaching life, but neither being complete, and both are equally valid. And Hesse really highlights this contrast in one part where he says, "The intellect loves what is solid formed. It wants to be able to rely on its symbols. It loves what is, not what is becoming, what is real and not what is possible. The intellect cannot live in nature, only against it, only as its antithesis." The next part is, through Goldmund's experience as a sculptor, Hesse reflects on the role of artistic creation in life. So firstly, Goldmund says this about the role of art in life. "Perhaps he thought the root of all art, and perhaps also of all intellectual activity, is the fear of death. We fear it, we shudder at the ephemeral nature of all things, we grieve to see the constant cycle of fading flowers and falling leaves, and are aware in our hearts of the certainty that we too are ephemeral and will fade away. So when as artists we create images, and as thinkers we search for laws and formulate ideas, we do so in order to salvage something from the great dance of death, to create something that will outlast our lifetime." Furthermore, he thinks there is an antithesis between him being free, exploring places and experiences like a wanderer, and him being settled in one place in order to create a sculpture worthy of artistic value and lasting value, that is. He realizes that one fundamentally has to make a choice between being ephemeral, making the most out of life's perishable experiences, or giving up exploring the variety of the rich experiences in order to create something that has permanence, so sacrificing one's impermanent experiences for something that one is able to create and hold there as always there. And he summarizes that when he says, "But surely the whole of this life has meaning only if both could be achieved, if life were not split by this barren either or, to create without paying the price of life, to live without renouncing the nobility of creativeness." So this is like, he thinks these two are essentially the most valuable things in life, but they can never be simultaneously achieved. And lastly, one thing that's worthy of note is the mother figure is something that's dominating the story. And in Goldmund's moments of extreme ecstasy or despair and agony, he could feel or see his mother, who was kind of like an absent figure in his life. And in the end, near his death, he also felt a return to his mother. So it gestures to a sense of life being ultimately seeking a return to that feeling of safety and love in the womb. In summary, I must emphasize how impressed I am by Hesse's different sorts of insight into life provided in his works. Each of his novels really aims to express with clarity a specific philosophy, and they're cathartic to the reader in the sense that it allows you to reach a very gratifying conclusion after reading them. However, I do acknowledge that his works suffer from a lack of literary experience because the plot works often too much in service of the message. And that's it for Hesse. If you found this video informative, please don't forget to like, share and subscribe.